Um, yeah, this week's been quite busy for me at work.
I know how you feel. I'm not blaming.
No, no, no.
It's hard, man.
I feel like I need to explain. Yeah, it's been quite busy. Um, I don't know. I feel responsible for sort of other people's work, so I'm kind of uh, maybe spending too much time and effort on helping those people out than maybe I should. But yeah, so it's been a bit busy. But we're going to talk about Redux. Redux, which is quite, uh, I think you should kind of understand the point of it and the problem it's solving, but it takes a little bit of time to kind of get used to how you use it, how you use it effectively. And part of that is when you connect it to React, it's not super straightforward. Um, so today, the first section is going to be about vanilla JavaScript, Redux without React. It very often goes hand in hand with React, but um, I actually like it as a tool for vanilla JavaScript apps, and it it's also a good way to kind of introduce some of its concepts. But first, why does it exist? Redux is all about state. So I want to know from you what is annoying. So maybe not actually, yeah, just anything ideally to do with just React, but kind of focusing on state and props, which sort of is all of React, isn't it? Focusing on that stuff. What have you found annoying about React? And hopefully I'm going to say, aha, well, Redux fixes that. I'm going to note some things down in here, I think. Does anyone have anything that they find annoying or complicated or confusing?
Yes. For me, it's like I'm trying to do the feature for the block feature and the rounding pants. So I have to pass. Maybe the way I think would be wrong. What I'm trying to do is I want to pass the props from children to parent and from child to parent, and also I want to share the the data between siblings. So it's like I have to do so many steps.
Okay.
First, I have to pass from child to parent, and then I have to use context to share the data between siblings. So it's like
Okay.
many complicated things.
Okay. Yeah. So
When I maybe
that's
debug.
that's interesting. Yeah. Okay. So context. That's something that we haven't really covered. So I guess you kind of found that yourself. Maybe Vasil told you about that. Um,
Yeah,
it's
I have to Google it how to do it. Yeah.
Yeah. So use context, props from children, siblings. All of this is actually about where state lives. So you have decided that some state lives in some child component, and then you realize that the parent needs to know about that state and a sibling needs to know about that state. So you're currently thinking, oh, so I need to pass that state to the parent and I need to pass it to a sibling. Basically, doing that is breaking a rule of React, breaking the rules. What you should do, you should lift. Is it lift state that is a
Are you
phrase.
showing us something? Because we can see your screen.
Oh, I can't see. Oh, can I? Right, I'm actually just posting messages in the chat on Meet. What can you see?
Yeah, I'm seeing the chat.
Okay.
Me too.
Uh,
Okay. Sorry, that's my bad. I pinned the video and I was expecting to see something.
yeah, but you should still see like my video that is just the Meet tab, which is a bit weird. Anyway, so the solution to those problems should be to lift state up. There's this phrase that kind of gets used when you're refactoring, when you do something like that. You've decided some state lives in a child. You realise it needs to be accessed from siblings or parents. So you decide, okay, I'm going to have that state live in a parent or an ancestor. Oh, I've just realised I've used ancestor and descendant incorrectly in the slides. I'll change those. And you should lift state up rather than use context. But all of that is related to where you are storing your state. So that's lucky that Redux fixes, or Redux provides an alternative option. So anything else? What else? What other things do people find annoying? Okay, nothing. I imagine you probably are not saying anything, well, partly because no one ever says anything, but also partly because you probably all agree with what Florence just said. That is okay. CSS, yeah. Sadly, Redux doesn't help with CSS, but this is really one of the kind of most irritating, I think, parts of React and learning React especially. You realise you've made quite a big mistake early on by storing a bunch of state in the wrong place, and then you have to go about and refactor it and move it up or down or whatever. So that is, I think, probably the most sort of frustrating part of using React. Aside from CSS, you're right, Florence. Which is why I use CSS frameworks, but Vasil tells me off whenever I use CSS frameworks. He says, make your own framework. Well, someone's already done it. Why have I got it? And no, anyway. So that's what's annoying. It is generally about state and passing state as props. So you've got state in app. You need that to be passed down to info page. You need that to be passed down to contact form. You need that to be passed down to email field. You have some state all the way up in app, and it needs to be passed all the way down to that email field. Then you have some change handler that is actually calling a function all the way up in app on that email field. So the function and the value both need to be passed down from app all the way down, and then the callback needs to go all the way up, a bit like this. I realise it might not be the best quality on Google Meet, but I'll post the link in Slack. But I think this is what passing state feels like. It's this massive chain of people throwing a basketball to each other, and eventually it goes in the hoop. And this tweet about a year ago, really, June 30th, 2019, like the day before I was going to do this exact Redux or like a Redux lesson, I saw this tweet and thought it was perfect. So this, I think, is just is kind of how it feels. So this is how you pass state down in React. And then if you look at the comments, some people are saying, and this is us using some sort of global state management like Redux. So Redux is ideally trying to solve that problem. You're passing state potentially use context, but you're passing state down through several generations. It's sometimes known as prop drilling. So you're drilling down into components and you're passing prop drilling. Another thing is local state can be confusing. So if you have state in your info page and state in your contact form and state in your about page, and all of these little bits of state have their own kind of life cycles, maybe that's okay, but eventually it does start to get a bit confusing. Oh, I actually don't have that piece of information on this page because that's being stored in this page, or is it over in this page? I can't remember where all my state is. So an option might be to simplify your state structure and store all of your state in app. All changes occur in app and not in ancestor components. That's where I've done it once. Descendant. It's bad now that computers kind of spell check everything. I don't know how to spell at all. Okay, so changes all occur in your app component, or whichever component is kind of highest up, and it stores absolutely all of the state about all different parts of your app. There's one benefit. Remember when we looked at storing local state in those omelette recipes, and an individual omelette recipe could store the state that says if it's showing the details or not showing the details, and then when that component is no longer displayed, we lose that state. So we keep the state if it's always stored in app or in one place, and it kind of just keeps all of that logic about if this happens, this state needs to be updated, and this piece of state also needs to be updated, and there's this logic that is applied when the state gets changed. So that could sort of solve the problem of local state being confusing, but it doesn't really solve the problem of passing those props and props and props and props and props and so on. So Redux is here to provide a solution. It follows a design pattern called Flux, and this all revolves around a central store. Store is pretty much just another term for state, or it is a place where state gets stored and managed. But you have this central store, and all components can get data direct from the store. So components will receive props, and they come from the central store. Anytime that store changes, it's just like a state change. Yeah, so it's kind of an interesting one doing an introduction to Redux, and on that same day where I found that tweet, there is this tweet: loading a state management library for a to-do app, which is essentially what we're going to do today. It's total overkill. And then there's this other picture which I like as well. It really is kind of confusing at first, but it scales really well to much bigger apps. If all of the logic that drives how your app changes is in one place and is separate to the code that kind of determines what it should look like, then hopefully you can already see that that's a positive. You want to separate the logic that updates your app from the logic that displays your app. So that's kind of one benefit of Redux, but it is... Sorry, I'm back to yawning again. Maybe it's a good thing we don't have too many slides this week, because I'll just get to code. It is overkill for small apps, but there are other benefits that Redux gives us that we'll discover later on. It's not just appropriate for big applications. So Redux is kind of made up of three parts, and the UI down here is React or is vanilla JavaScript or whatever. We have actions. These are when things happen, when a user interacts with your site, something happens. A reducer is what handles those actions, and a store we've already talked about. A store is what keeps your state, keeps all of your data in a place that might change and then trigger some events when it does change. So these three parts: action, reducer, and store. First, we'll talk about actions. Actions are just objects. They're really nothing special. The only difference between just being a normal object and being allowed to be an action is that it must have a type. It must have a key of type. What the value is, it actually is up to you. As long as there is a key of type, Redux sees it and goes, okay, that's an action, that's a valid action. I'm going to pass that along. Does anyone know how I can stop yawning? I think it's like a weird virtual call thing because I can't see anyone. I just feel like I'm talking to myself. And anyway, sorry. I think this is my last lesson I'm doing with you guys. So I'm sorry about the last several weeks of me yawning. So the type is usually a descriptive string. It can be anything you want, as long as it's kind of unique, as long as you can figure out the type, and it's your code that's going to be using the type. So as long as you can determine one type of action from another type of action is fine. So you could use numbers or I don't know, objects, or you could use all sorts of things. Generally, it is a string that describes the action, and generally the strings are kind of formatted like this, but it really can be anything. So here we have two actions. They are objects, and they have a key of type where the value is a string, either count up or count down, and that's all they are. They are a bit like functions. So if we, we'll cover this a bit later, if we dispatch an action, which is this object, which has a key of type, value of count up, that's a bit like calling a function called count up. That is saying, okay, go and do some counting up logic for me and increase some number in some state somewhere. But it's a bit like calling a function called count up or count down, right? We've written functions like that a million times already. Functions have arguments. So if we want a generic version of the count up and count down, count up and count down functions. Then we can have an action of count and pass a payload. Now, this is where there are fewer kind of conventions, where an action must have a key of type and a value can be anything. The rest of the structure of the object is up to you. So often you might have a separate key of payload, which is kind of the argument that you'd pass to this function. So I want to count and I want you to use the number 14 when you're counting. Here, this is generally how I structure it. This way allows you to kind of pass multiple arguments and be descriptive, give names to those arguments, if we're thinking about these like functions. So count, payload, amount 14. So we're going to count, or increase the number by 14 or whatever. I've got amount and increment, that's slightly confusing. Or it doesn't really have to be payload. Like I said, as long as it's an object with a key of type, Redux is going to accept it. So we can just have type count and increment 14. We'd have another action that has another type that has another key, doesn't have the key of increment. The benefit of this is there's some sort of structure. All of your actions are going to have a type and a payload, or actually they may not have a payload, but if they're sending something, they will always have a type and a payload. Whereas this, there could be kind of all sorts of key value pairs that you can include. But there's no real consensus over the best way to do that. Personally, I go with this second one. A reducer. So the reducer is the second, the middle part of that diagram we saw earlier. And it's just a function. It actually is nothing special. It's a function and it receives two arguments. The current state and the action. So the action, remember, is one of these. So type, count, payload, amount 14. And the current state is whatever the current state is. It might be an object that has a key of counter on it, and that starts at 0, and we want to increase that or decrease that. It could just be the number. It could just be the number that is representing that counter. It could be anything, really. But the current value of state and the action are passed in as arguments, and the function returns the new state. So last week, I think, when we were looking at use effect, we used a set state method that is returned from the use state hook, and you can pass a function to that setter method, and it works in much the same way. You receive the current state in that function and you return the new value of the state. It's just the same in a reducer. So here is an easy to explain and understand example, but actually bad practice example. And I'll talk about why it's bad practice later on. Maybe I'll demonstrate why it's bad practice. So we have a reducer function. It's called a reducer. That's a sensible name for it. It receives two arguments. It receives an argument of state and an argument of action. So we are storing an object that has a key of counter we're going to increase counter by 1 if the action type is count up. If the action type is count down, we're going to decrease counter by 1. If the action type is just count, then we'll assume that there is a payload with the action that has a key of increment on it that is going to increase it, or that increment could be a negative number. So we add on the increment to the counter. So we are mutating that object. State.counter gets changed on this object that gets passed in, and then we return that object back to where it came from. So that the important part there is that we are mutating that state object, which is the bad practice part of it, and we'll talk about that a bit more later on. But the key point is it receives state, it receives an action, it looks at what should happen, usually by looking at the type of that action. It does something to the state and returns the new state value. A store is just like state using useState or in a class component. When the state changes, when the store changes, it triggers an event, just like normal React state does. And so we, or React, or whichever framework you're using, we can re-render the user interface when it does change. So React does this already with its own state. It's going to do the same thing with Redux state. When we're using Redux with vanilla JavaScript, we have to we have to subscribe to these events. We have to subscribe to the store to be notified when it changes. Okay, some terminology, and some of this will be repeating what I've already said, but there's quite a bit of new terminology here. So we dispatch an action to the store. That's how we describe kind of calling those functions, how we tell the store that we want to count up or down or whatever. So we dispatch an action to the store. We subscribe to changes in the state in the store. The store passes the action through the reducer, and then the store is updated, which triggers our subscription, and we update the user interface. So dispatch an action to the store. The store passes the action through the reducer. The reducer then returns the new state value, and the store is updated. Because we've subscribed to changes, the user interface is going to update. Oh, I forgot, that's it. Okay. So, does anyone have any questions now before I start building something in vanilla JavaScript using vanilla Redux?
Could you please explain again about subscribe?
Subscribe, yeah. So what's it similar to? I suppose it's similar to listening to events on elements. So when the user clicks on a button, do this, and do this is like run a function. So it's the same thing. We have this store that is storing some data. Whenever the data in that store changes, it calls a function that we have told it to call, and so we kind of get notified almost whenever there is a change in the store. So it's what React is doing kind of behind the scenes. When you call set state, it changes some object, some value that it has somewhere, and then it tells your component, okay, there has been a change in this data, so I'm going to call this function again and re-render the page. So React is already doing it. We subscribe to changes. It's a bit like an event listener, and that function is going to get triggered every time there's a change in the store. Okay. So we're going to start with vanilla code. Has anyone got a good idea for a thing? Because otherwise we're just going to do a thing that counts up and down. Counting. And like I suppose we could do a to-do app. Do you want to do a to-do app? We could do, let's do a counter first and then do a to-do app. Maybe we'll do a to-do app with React. Okay, passing state feels like, so this getting started is, I don't really like that. Yeah, script tag directly. This getting started page is pretty good. So where in the past you might have used, I don't know, jQuery, or you might have used kind of slightly older libraries, sort of things that come with WordPress or whatever, because I know quite a lot of you have dabbled with web stuff for quite a long time. Their documentation, I find, is not as friendly. It might be these days. The most recent versions of these old libraries might be kind of friendly, but this sort of modern generation of libraries, their documentation is usually really well written, not necessarily easy to understand, but kind of easy to follow. And Redux is one of them. I think their documentation's great. It is quite a complicated subject, and so they do a good job of explaining it in a relatively simple way. So we're loading up this Redux HTML. We're loading up this Redux script from from a CDN. It gets executed. So Redux is just available on the window, and we can see it's not that complicated. Redux itself doesn't really give us too many functions. The important one that we're going to use is create store. We're also going to use combine reducers a bit later on. Apply middleware. Don't really need to talk about that. Bind action creators. I don't even know what that is used for. Compose. I vaguely remember something about compose, but I certainly have never used it. The vast majority of the time, you're just going to be using create store. This is obviously a function to create a new store for us. One other thing in here is there's an object called _ do not use _ action types. And these are kind of built-in Redux actions that we'll see later on, but these actions will actually get dispatched to our store. So you can kind of see what a good way to store your actions is. We have an object, we have init, and the value of that is actually set to some like slightly complicated at Redux. It's a special Redux action, and init, and then the kind of version of Redux, and the same thing with replace. So that is how we're going to structure our action types a bit later on. So that's what Redux gives us. Let's JS. And I'm going to chuck that. Oh, I'm using like a Windows keyboard on my Mac at the moment, so I'm all confused all the time. Okay, so let's load that at the bottom. You know what? I'm just going to steal it all from Flatiron. I mean, it's me. It's self plagiarism, but okay. So, and that is called main. Okay, hopefully it looks much nicer now. There we go. I mean, it's still a bit weird, but great. So we have some counter buttons that are going to increase and decrease this counter. We've also got a separate part of our page that is kind of unrelated to this counter, that is just going to show us the key that has just been pressed. I'm sure I've done stuff like this with you before, but this time we're going to use Redux. So in main.js, we need to create our store. So we use that redux.createStore function from earlier that we saw in our console. Let's reload the page. We get an error. Expected the reducer to be a function. So let's look at the arguments that we should pass to create store. So we pass a reducer, we pass preloaded state, and we pass an enhancer. Now, it really doesn't actually need those second two arguments. We just need the reducer. So even before we can create a store, we need our reducer to exist. And our reducer is nothing special. It is just a function that receives two arguments of state and action, and it returns a state, a value that represents the new state. In this case, it's going to be an object. Let's say counter 0 and key is A, something like that, something completely arbitrary. So now we can call create store and we can pass that reducer. So we reload the page, we get no errors. We can now look at our store. So the store has 5 functions on sort of 4 functions really. Dispatch. Remember, this was in that terminology slide. We can dispatch an action to our store, and you can see it's a function and it takes an action as an argument. We have a function called getState. That is going to return the current value stored as state. replace reducer is if we need to change the reducer for some reason, we can call it and pass it a new function to use as the reducer. Again, I've never used that kind of manually myself. Maybe React Redux does it in the background sometimes, but I've never needed to use that. And subscribe, so here we pass something called listener, which again should kind of feel a bit familiar to you when you're using subscribe. It's a bit like an event listener. We call subscribe and we pass it a function that we use actually for me as a handler. So I would probably refer to that listener as a handler. It is the function that handles when something happens rather than a listener. But they're kind of interchangeable. So let's look at what the state currently is. It is an object, the key of counter, value of 0, key of key, and a value of A. So the only place we've written that is in our reducer. We haven't defined that out here anywhere. We have just defined this function that returns this value. Therefore, we can assume that this reducer function has already been called. We haven't called it. We haven't called reducer. We haven't dispatched any actions to our store. So what's going on? We can call console log my reducer is called. It logs out. My reducer is called. Let's look at the state. So here, state is undefined. The first time your reducer is called, it doesn't know what the current value of state is. Remember, that's what that first argument is. That is the current value of state. But if your reducer is the thing that tells you what the value of state is, and it hasn't yet been called, how does it know what the initial value of state should be? So that's why this reducer gets called with an action with this special Redux do not use action types dot init. That is the action type that has been passed through our reducer. It is initializing the reducer, initializing the store, getting the initial value of the state, and so it passes undefined because state doesn't exist, and whatever we return gets used as the new state. So that's why when we do store.getState, it gives us this object. Okay. So now we want to call our reducer again. We want to change the state somehow. We dispatch an action to the store. If we call it without passing an action, it says actions must be plain objects. Use custom middleware for async actions. So it's kind of thinking maybe we're trying to do something asynchronous, and I don't know. It doesn't quite realize that we're passing nothing. It knows that we're not passing something that it knows is an action, but it's not being super friendly right now and saying you aren't passing anything, you need to pass an object with a key of type. So now let's pass an object. This is slightly more friendly, actions may not have an undefined type property. Have you misspelled a constant? So they're kind of trying to help you out there. But if we do pass it something, but it doesn't have a type, then it gives us this warning, which is pretty useful. Now, if we are going to define a type with the value of count up, we see my reducer is called, there is our current state, there is our action, and here, okay, slightly annoyingly, store.dispatch actually returns the action back to you. I don't really know why they do that, it's a bit annoying, but store.dispatch, because we don't call the reducer ourselves, we dispatch an action to the store, that passes the action through to the reducer, but also passes the current value of state. So we can successfully dispatch actions, but state is staying the same every single time. So if action.type is count up state.counter plus plus. That's what we did, and counter can be state.counter. So let's see what this does. It's gonna call our reducer, passing in the current state and the action. If the action type is count up, then increase that counter value. Otherwise, just keep the state counter value as it is and return this new object. Let's see what that does. We immediately get an error. Cannot read property counter of undefined. So what's undefined? Main 9 state counter. So state is undefined. Luckily, we're already logging it out here, so we know that that state value is undefined. Remember, it doesn't know what our initial value of state is, so state.counter is just not possible. This is not a value, it's undefined. So the common practice here is to define some initial state object and we can use a default argument value if the state is undefined, then use this object. That's all that is saying. So this is the default value for this argument whenever it gets called and the argument is undefined. It's going to use that initial state value, and therefore the first time the reducer is called, our state is actually going to be counter 0 key none. Let's call store.getState again, counter 0 key A. I still have this key A hard coded in here. We can pass state.key, get state, and now we have counter 0 key none. This is the initial state. Now we can call dispatch a few times. You can see it's counting up. But now let's get the current value of our store. It is the current state of our store is counter is 4 and key is none. So if we want do something anytime our store has changed, what do? We subscribe to it. Store.subscribe, do this function, console.log current state, store.get state, so that's that function we were calling to see what the state is. And now let's just say my reducer is called current state. Let's do that. So my reducer is called store.subscribe. I'm surprised that it didn't. Oh yeah, because at this point, so the init action is called at this point. Although actually no, because that's not store. Oh, I've just done store.getState. Yeah, so create store passes the init action through the reducer, and so on this line we haven't yet subscribed to any changes. So Redux is kind of making the assumption you don't really need to do anything with that init action. That's just for Redux itself. So now we can call dispatch and count up, and there we get my reducer is called. Then we get current state logged out with the current state. Every time we count up, that is increasing our counter value. So in here we've got counter value, counter element, document query selector, counter value, and so we have our state, which is going to be the current state, counter value, counter element inner HTML, inner text is state.counter. So every time there is a change to the state of our store, get that new state and then update our DOM. Okay, and that is pretty much all of Redux. That is all you do. Now, it is massive overkill for this sort of thing. But if all of your components in your entire app, they all communicate with this one store, they are all dispatching actions, it keeps all of your logic in one place. Everything that affects our app is going to be inside this function, essentially. And that's where it becomes really useful. So, counter, we've got those buttons, ID up, up button and down button. So up button dot on click, we want to dispatch an action to our store that is of the type count up, and we do the same for the down button dot on click store dot dispatch down. So this again should feel very familiar. I'm sure we've done this sort of thing, and instead of store dispatch it would just be a function that is called count up. But here, if all of your different components, all the parts of your app are communicating with the central store, they must dispatch an action, and count down isn't doing anything. We need to support the action type of count down, there. State.counter minus a minus. The reason I laughed, the amount of typos that I make, and I think it's just pretty normal when you're coding. You make a million typos all the time. As I was typing that, I thought I'll demonstrate an issue with this by deliberately making a typo, but then I wrote it correctly and then thought, okay, that is going to look too obvious if I add another N or something. So the amount of times I actually make typos, but when I wanted to make a typo, my head just forced me to spell it correctly. Anyway, let's imagine that I did make a typo. That was the typo that I was trying to make. I was trying to not type the W. Brains are stupid, aren't they? So I've just written, I'm dispatching an action called countdown, and in my reducer, I am handling an action type of also count down, I think. So we are going to count up, but count down doesn't actually work because we're dispatching an action with this string and we are looking for an action with this string. So again, I've said this plenty of times to you guys already, but strings are bad. Your code, your browser, nothing knows that this doesn't actually exist. But if we have action types, which is going to be an object, which is pretty much just going to map count up to count up and count down to count down. Now we can actually refer to these in code. VS Code or whatever you're using is going to auto-complete for you, so it's still possible but harder to make typos. Count down and type here action types dot count up, action types dot count down. So I just said it's possible to make typos, but it's a bit harder. So we can do count don. We're going to sort of see that VS Code is already going, oh, I don't think that exists. We're going to be able to test that out in our browser. We're then going to get this error. Actions may not have an undefined type property. That's because this object is defined. This property on this object is not defined, so we're passing undefined to our reducer. So it is still possible. However, if you think back to three weeks ago, I don't know, and TypeScript, and you should know that TypeScript already would go, that doesn't exist. It's already telling you at this point in your console that you've tried to use something that doesn't exist. So that's where TypeScript is really nice. But we've now got counting up and counting down working. And again, a bit like when we started talking about React, I hope you can see even just this code, how it would be useful. And I think it's almost easier to see how it would be useful with vanilla code like this. So if you had this available to you 3-4 weeks ago, however long ago it was before React, do you think it would have helped if in here this is the one place where you're updating your user interface and all of your events just dispatched actions to your store? Do you think that would help? I'll take that as a yes. Okay. After that sort of initial bit of Redux, does anyone have any questions? I'll finish the key part of that little project, and then I'll do some refactoring, and then we'll move on to React. But does anyone have any questions about Redux at the moment?
Yes. Could you please go back to your codes?
Yeah.
So for the hashing, can you please scroll up a little bit? So inside the reducer, like we can have all the functions we want to do, which is hashing, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes. So I will refactor it later to be a bit sort of neater, because you might already be thinking, oh, this is just going to be one massive function that does loads and loads of different things.
I think that they will have so many if else, if else, if else, if.
Yes, yeah. But you can kind of take these out to a function. So I don't know, count up. You can have a function called count up or return count up, and then that's up here. Can't count up, and I don't know. You pass the state through there. State. So you can kind of farm these things out if you want, but I will refactor later to show you a neater way to kind of structure your reducers. But yeah, you should already think like, oh, that's just going to be confusing.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Actually, sorry, Florence, I think I kind of interrupted you. Was that your question? Were you just asking, oh, that looks scary and will get big?
Yes, I just want to make sure my understanding. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, good. All right. So, the key. Let's deal with the key. So anytime we press a key, we want to store that key that was pressed, and we want to display the value of that key in this box. So first, key pressed, we create a new action type, key pressed. And just to sort of demonstrate this, it could be 5, it could be any sort of random silly number, as long as it is a unique value. And so you might be thinking, okay, now we have action types count up, action types count down. It doesn't need to be a string like this. It can just be a unique value. This could be 1, this could be 2, this could be 3, and that's all good. I'm going to leave it like this, and I'll show you later why this is not ideal. But yeah, we have another else if action type is action types dot key pressed, then state dot key is going to be something that comes from our event dot key or whatever it is, but our action is going to have a payload. This is a bit like our argument. So action dot payload dot key, that is going to be the key that was just pressed, and it's included in a payload object on our action object. So we take that key out, store it in our state, and return that object. So okay, then we need an event handler, document on key down, event store.dispatch, so type is going to be action types dot key pressed, and the payload is going to be an object with key of event dot key, I think it is. So this function receives an event, it dispatches an action to the store, and it includes payload where a key of key has a value of event.key. That goes through our reducer. Our action has the payload, we update the state with the key. We then want to display that somewhere. Key value, that's very confusing, isn't it? So counter value and key value, key L dot inner text is state dot key. Okay, so it's been set to none because in HTML it says press a key, but our kind of initial state has it as none. That's fine. Now I press a key and it displays the key that was pressed. So we are passing a payload, which is a bit like an argument, through to our reducer, and then our reducer is handling it and updating the key. Now, let's have a look at a few of the issues. The first one is this one that may not be so apparent, but one of the really powerful things about Redux is the dev tools. Now, there's a bit of faff. It's only really a bit of faff in vanilla JavaScript, but and in React it kind of helps you with this, but there's a bit of faff here. So I have to say window.redux store is our store, and I have to say window.redux DevTools extension and window Redux DevTools extension, and I call that here, I think. So let's see if that works, and if so, can't read or change. Oh, Redux. No store found. Follow the instructions. Okay, I've done it wrong. Redux DevTool extension. Yeah, okay, so reducer. For a basic Redux store, simply, oh, every time. Okay. It doesn't like the fact that it is not served on a web server, so I will serve it. There we go. Okay. So these DevTools are really nice in similar ways to the React DevTools. We can see this on the left. This panel is like a history of actions. We can click. We can see the action. It has a key of type, and that type is init. So that is that initial Redux initialize action. Click on counter or counter plus plus, and we get this type 1. That's not very confusing. Or I did it 10 minutes ago, so I can kind of remember that means count up. Count minus minus, that is 2. So 2, that I think that means count down, go back to 1, and you just get this big sort of list of numbers, and I'm going to press some keys, and that's not very descriptive at all. We can look at these, This has a payload, so I can kind of go, okay, yeah, payload is key. So this is referring to the key that was pressed. I sort of understand it, but if we have, it doesn't have to be like that. Count up, please. Count down, please. As long as they are unique, a key was pressed, then that's all that matters. And now it is much more descriptive. It's a bit stupid. You don't need manners, but this is much more descriptive. We get this history of actions. And now what's really cool about Redux is that it's not updating. Now, I think I know why this wasn't updating. So none TT, nothing's really changing in any of these. So count up please, we can see the state. So we can see the action, the type was count up please. The state is now counter 10. Difference, we can see anything that's changed. So you might have a massive state object and you only want to see what's changed. So this has gone from 9 to 10. Trace this, yeah, read that. And we can actually, it can give us a test for Jest or Mocha or any of these other languages to test that action with that current state comes out with that value. So this is one benefit of Redux, that these tools are really good and it's really testable. So your reducer, which is the only thing that determines everything that happens in your entire website, is just a function that receives the current state and an action. So that is entirely testable. You can write tons of automated tests that test your reducer, and if someone adds a new feature, they need to run all of the previous tests, and it's super straightforward. You can write separate tests to test that given a state object, the user interface displays it in this particular way, but your reducer and what happens is actually kind of separate to the user interface. So these tools are really excellent. But here, what's super cool, I thought I did it if I just clicked on it. Okay, jump, I have to do jump. I can go back in time. So here we are back at the start. What's that? That's go. Oh no, that's download. I don't want that. Okay, yeah, that's what I was looking for. So this is like a timeline. If any of you have done sort of video editing or music or anything like that, then you should be familiar with this. I think one a second. So we can play all of the actions that appeared, that were triggered on this page. You can then take this big array of actions. So in fact, I just did download state 1 JSON, keep. Let's look at it. Payload true. Does that give us everything? Count up, please. State. Type. Okay, state of the Redux dev tools or the Redux store or whatever. But you can take this full list of actions. If you get an error on your website, you can catch that error. You can say, okay, Redux, give me all of the actions that ever occurred, and you can post that to your server. You can have two servers, one that is serving your API, serving your data as normal, you can have another server that's just like dealing with all of your error logs. So anytime a user encounters an error, you can capture all of these actions, post them off to your error server, and then your developers get a notification. You can then take that JSON payload, dump it in, so go in there, you can upload that JSON payload, and it will play the exact steps that your user carried out to get that error that they saw. So that's really, really good. And in your sort of current position, I think people who are kind of starting their careers and learning Redux for the first time, I think you can generally kind of see how that would be helpful. But I think doing all of that and setting all of that up is several years down the line. It's that big, that sort of entire pipeline will certainly be set up by senior people. There may be a chance that relatively early on in the first sort of couple of years of your career, you'll be debugging using some logs that were created in this sort of way. But actually doing all of that is a few years off. Actually setting it up is a few years off. But hopefully you can see why Redux and everything around it makes it really good for sort of big, proper professional projects, as opposed to little counter apps. Okay, so that's the first sort of downside fixed, where we had these numbers before, and now we have strings. We have a nice descriptive history of actions. Now, as Florence pointed out, actually, I kind of want to do something else while it's in this state. Okay. So I want to, doing it this way is kind of the right-ish way to do it. I'm going to change it to this. This is how it was in the slides, and I said it's not great, but it should be pretty much the same thing, right? State.counter plus plus, state counter minus minus. We were just doing an object with state counter and state key. Pretty much the same. So let's see what happens now. It's increasing. That's perfectly fine. And as I'm doing this, I think, is it actually going to do what I want? It is. Great. So we've jumped back to the start of this timeline, all the way back to the init phase. We can go back and forth. We can step through our actions, and we look at the state object at all of these points in time, and nothing is actually changing. It's all what the state ended up as. So I click this 12 times. I can do it again, and it's going to go up to 13. Count up, please. It's now 13, but we go all the way back, and this is still 13. Press a bunch of keys. We have to sort of reload this, but it now displays H, that last one that I tapped. That's because this state object is actually, you know what, I think it is actually this initial state object. Let's initial state, it is. So one of the most important things to realize in your reducer is you mustn't mutate anything. You always return a new state value. So for this setup, it's relatively straightforward. We can return a new object with the current value of state spread out. We could return a new object with state and a key of counter, which is state.counter -1, which I would probably do it like this, I think. And so now I've done it sort of, oh no, I'm spreading out down here. So now we do have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Now we go back here. They are separate objects every time. So it stores all of these separate objects. We go back in time, it loads up that completely new object that it did use at that point in time, and therefore we can see what the state of our app was when that action got dispatched. So it's pretty easy to make that mistake. It's easy to make that mistake with nested objects, certainly, but always return a new value in your reducer. You may not encounter it when we were using this. It was fine, it still worked. Only, oh yeah, this is, have I shown you this? I feel like I've shown you this before, haven't I? When you press Command Option I to open the DevTools, it says dead. I don't really know why. What was I saying? I like that. I don't think, however many times I've given this exact same lesson, and this always comes up, and I always have this weird little distraction. I've never looked it up. Maybe I shouldn't look it up. It's like when you see someone's face who's on the radio, you get really disappointed because they're not. Anyway, so that is a kind of introduction to Redux. I think I was saying something, but I've forgotten now. Oh yeah, you might not notice it as a user, but as soon as you open your Redux DevTools, you'll realise that actually it's not quite working exactly how it's supposed to, and there may be other bugs that you encounter. It might not just be a case of these DevTools not working. Okay, so the last bit of refactoring that we're going to do, oh, it's 7:30 already. I don't think we're going to get onto React Redux. The plan was always to do sort of vanilla Redux today and then React Redux on Thursday, but sometimes this goes a bit quicker than others. So I don't think we're going to get onto it, and I think we can kind of refactor this or add more stuff or answer all of your endless questions that you usually have, or you can ask me stuff about your React stuff that you're stuck on. So last bit of refactoring. If we look at our store, lifted store, was that there before? I don't know what that is. Oh no, it's not even on there, is it? It's Redux. We looked at Redux earlier. So Redux has a function called combine reducers. And we use combine reducers to, surprise, surprise, combine multiple reducers together. Each of these reducers generally is referring to a key on this, on your state object. So we can have a function called counter reducer, which takes state, which initially is initial state dot counter. And we still have the action, we still have the full action, but inside our counter reducer, we're only going to get 0. We're not going to get the full object. So each reducer only deals with the value related to a particular key. So if action.type is action types count up, return state +1. So that's much nicer. Action.type, action types.count down, return state -1, else just return state and don't do anything to it. We can do the same with key, so key reducer. State initially is going to be set to initial state.key. We receive our action. We only want to do something if the action type is key pressed. We just return action.payload.key. Otherwise, we return the state unchanged. So we return the new value. So in key reducer, we're going to return the new value here, which is just the key in the payload. And in our counter reducer, we're going to return the value that goes here. So +1, -1, or just nothing, no change. So we can get rid of our reducer. I'm going to just leave it there so you have access to it. Now, instead of just passing reducer like this, we can say combined reducers is a result of redux.combine reducers, and we pass an object this time. We pass an object which pretty much maps exactly to this object. So we have a key of counter and a value of counter reducer. We have a key of key and a value of key reducer. So instead of our single reducer function, we're going to pass the result of the combine reducers function call. So it's behaving in exactly the same way, but now we have these two separate functions which deal with these completely independent parts of our state. A small extra bit of refactoring: if you call that counter and you call that key, you can use key value shorthand, and your combine reducers object just looks like this. So this is generally how people structure their reducers. This is generally how people call combine reducers, and you kind of define a function that is the same name as a key on your state object. Okay. So I want 3 questions on Redux, or we can talk about React, or nothing else, just Redux and React. Anyone?
I've got one about all the history, kind of the history of that debug.
Yeah.
Just wondering if you had like a really complicated app would that start to affect, would the kind of detailed logging kind of interrupt the performance at all? If it was a really budget Android device or something? Or would...
So it's a good question, and not even necessarily related to the dev tools, but the people who are slightly obsessed with performance do seem to have a go at Redux sometimes. It seems like it has a bad reputation regarding performance. I've never really had any issues like that. I think generally your entire sort of app and how everything fits together is really more impactful on performance rather than just going through Redux. But as you might have noticed, I'm going to sort of click 5 times quickly, and then you'll see that this waits a bit of time before it actually updates. It's not real time, similar to the React dev tools. So it is trying to compensate any sort of slowdown by having a very slow kind of update loop in itself. Another thing, so this function call, this says, so I have the Chrome extension installed on my browser, and that just means it loads up a JavaScript file. That's all that Chrome extensions are, and that particular JavaScript file is just saying window.redux DevTools extension equals function that does a bunch of stuff. So here we say if window Redux DevTools extension exists, then just call Redux DevTools extension, and that is going to connect the DevTools to the store. Now, this line could just not be there in your production version, and in fact it kind of shouldn't be there in your production version. So your dev code is going to have that line and it's going to connect to DevTools extension, but your production version, Webpack can automatically kind of, well, you can configure Webpack to remove this sort of thing, so you don't actually connect to the end user's DevTools.
Now, okay, so it's only if they're running the Redux DevTools.
Yes.
Okay.
However,
then what was that bit you were talking about? Just you could log it on a server or something?
Okay.
The kind of steps that a user took sounds really useful.
Yeah, so that is so you can access kind of all of the actions that have occurred on a store. I mean, to be honest, I actually don't know if there's a built-in way to just say store.history or something like that. But because they all go through a reducer, you can add some middleware or something that is just storing actions, an array of actions. You just keep doing actions.push the latest action, and then when something does go wrong, you can do fetch like errors method post body JSON stringify all those actions, just send them off to your server, and then you can kind of clear the actions if you want to. So that there is middleware to kind of help you with this, but ultimately that is what Redux DevTools is doing in the background. It's just storing a big old list of all of the actions. So
yeah, cool. And that wouldn't affect the user performance.
No, exactly. So I find this interesting. Often I show people this blog post. It's quite nice. In fact, generally JavaScript in plain English is quite a nice, whatever it is on Medium, publication on Medium. This is quite a good blog post, really. But so I often have this one open at the same time as doing this lesson, and if I load my page, okay, it kind of did that, but I think if I already had it open and whatever, you can actually switch between any of them, any instances of Redux in any of the tabs. Medium uses Redux and is clearly connecting to DevTools. So anything that happens, I'm going to, I don't know, click on that. No. I don't think the entire site of Medium, but some part of Medium. Hide Google one tap, set trace, has rendered Google one tap. So it's something to do with Google. Oh, set post read. Okay, so I've just finished reading and that has triggered. Anyway, so you might, if you kind of keep this open and just generally navigate the web, you might see that various sites are actually connecting to your Redux DevTools, which is kind of interesting. But to answer your question, no, this shouldn't really affect performance because you shouldn't be connecting to it. I think the issue that people have with Redux and performance generally is sort of related to related to React. So if you have this one store and everything is looking at this one store, pretty much everything's gonna kind of like re-render anytime that store changes, even if it doesn't need to re-render, even if something hasn't really changed. I think that's. I think I'm oversimplifying. I don't think it really happens like that. And yeah, like I say, it's very, very widely used, and it wouldn't have got so popular if it was genuinely like not performant. I don't think it's worth thinking about, really. Yeah. Does anyone have any other questions? I can add some more stuff to that app if you want. But Cedo says, I was wondering, how will you do when you have a different page? Do you just call Redux something to get the stored Redux function? A different page. It's a good question, but essentially Redux is intended to be used on SPAs, on single page applications. So where you might be thinking of having several different HTML files or several different sort of requests to a server to get a new page, and you're thinking, oh, my Redux store is going to be lost every time I navigate. Yeah, it is. So it is really designed for single page applications where it might look like you're navigating, like using React Router or something like that, but you're actually staying on the same page with the same JavaScript that's loaded up. I can't think how you get around that. I mean, if you need to share data from one page to another, then you have to use sort of, I don't know, local storage or session storage or query parameters or all sorts of things like that. Each page could have its own Redux store that gets created every time the user loads that page, that stores its own state. But yeah, between pages, that's not super straightforward. Florence, what sort of environment setup need to start using Redux? I mean, to implement with React Redux. Okay, so we will, or Vasile, I think, yeah, we're all mixed up. I think it's going to be Vasile on Thursday. Vasile will do React Redux, but So React Redux, the docs are pretty nice. The quick start is quite good. So this page is the kind of official Redux documentation, and then this page is the React Redux documentation. So it gets a bit confusing, and one of these I prefer over the other, and I can't quite remember which one. I think it's this one. I think it's this one. Why use connecting, accessing the store? Okay. Yeah, so now it's slightly confusing because of hooks. I think when we started talking about hooks and everything, generally React, I have mentioned that React is in this sort of in-between phase where lots of stuff is still written using class components, and so they're kind of migrating to hooks, but all of the documentation especially is still written using class components. And although this is not strictly class components versus functional components, because of hooks, this is not necessary anymore. And this is the bit that I found initially super confusing, and I think people find quite confusing. So here you have your component called counter, you have your function. This is commented out, but imagine there is a component that's defined here. Generally, underneath your component, you define two functions: map state to props and map dispatch to props. So first, map state to props. That is a function that receives the current state of the Redux store, and it returns all the props that this component needs. So you're no longer using JSX to pass props to a component. You're getting them directly from the store. So this counter needs a prop of counter, and the value is state.counter, so the current value of counter in our Redux store. Now this example is slightly confusing, but map dispatch to props again. So where counter needs a prop of counter, which is the value of counter, it also needs some props to increase the counter, to decrease the counter, or reset the counter. So where we pass sort of values and functions to change those values as props, you get the values out of state, and you get the functions from your sort of dispatch calls. So this is confusing, and I generally don't do it like this, but using this action creators pattern makes it nice and neat and so on. So you define these two functions, and then you call connect, passing in the two functions. That function returns a function that you then call and pass in your original component. So now you've connected your component to the Redux store, and everywhere you render it, where previously you'd have to do counter is like state.value and increment is one thing and reset is another thing. Now you don't have to pass any props. You just render the counter component, and it connects to the Redux store itself and gets all of those values and functions from Redux. So that's a benefit. It makes your JSX really nice and neat and readable. So that is a nice side effect. Let's quickly look at hooks. So use selector. Equality comparisons. Now it's not super nice. Use selector. So here is this same idea. So we have a counter. We don't have to do that map state to props, map counter to props. We just call the hook use selector. We pass it a function that receives the state object, and we return the value that we want to access over here. So we return state.counter. Here, to do, we have a to-do list item. It is receiving props. We are rendering it in JSX. It's being passed a prop of an ID, and we access that particular to-do item using that ID and store it in this value. So this is certainly kind of neater and nicer rather than map state to props, map dispatch to props. That's not the nicest thing in the world. Create selector, I don't really see the point of that. Use actions has been removed. Use dispatch. So again, use dispatch just connects to the store, and we can just call dispatch just like earlier we were calling store.dispatch. Dispatch is the function, is the same thing as store.dispatch. So we can dispatch our action to the store just by saying use dispatch. We don't have to say use dispatch to props and any of that stuff. Use store if we do want to access the store. So example only, do not do this in a real app. The component will not automatically update if the store state changes. So this is not very common. Yeah, this hook should probably not be used frequently. Prefer use selector. You might want to use that. Having said all of that about React Redux, you might not need Redux. There's this sort of you might not need phrase that gets thrown around with lots of libraries. You might not need JavaScript, you might not need Moment.js, jQuery, WordPress, Bootstrap, etc. You might not need Redux is an article written by Dan Abramov, who invented Redux and is on the official React team at Facebook. He's one of the big names in React development. In 2016, after people used Redux very widely and it really goes hand in hand with React, or kind of around 2015, early 2016, React had some changes that made it easier, that made state management a bit easier, and therefore the discussion started to be like, is Redux overkill? Do we actually need Redux? And so he says you might not need Redux. And on top of all of that, in the last 18 months or so, since hooks have been introduced, React has its own use reducer hook. So use reducer has, it returns state and returns a dispatch function. Here's the counter example from the use state, rewritten to use a reducer. So we have our reducer function that looks just like our Redux reducer function. We have our dispatch, which is just the same as store.dispatch. State is now an object, so we just have this one use reducer call instead of all of our different use state calls. So this is kind of taking some of the ideas of Redux, but built into React. So yeah, it kind of gets quite confusing when you're hooking up React with Redux. It's a bit hard to tell what Redux is really doing and even the benefits that it gives you. This is why. So when I first started teaching at Flatiron, I saw that there were supposed to be kind of two lessons. One, an introduction to Redux, and then one React Redux. And when I first started, I hadn't really used Redux very much, and I didn't really get it. I didn't really like it that much, and so I didn't see the point. Why have two lessons? So I just combined it into one. Just did React Redux. That's all you need to know. So just go ahead. But that was such a bad idea, because it's just very difficult to tell what Redux is really doing and how you even use it when you just learn it from the perspective of Redux with React. So this is why I like to spend time on Redux, just vanilla Redux, because it does get confusing with React. That was a very long answer, Florence. I think you're doing it deliberately so no one else has to ask questions. Okay. I think that's it for today then.